Hey, what's going on, everybody? Hey, this your boy C Hess with Motivated Minds. And I got a question for y'all. Have you ever been at work, maybe at a barbecue, perhaps just sitting around with your friends, and y'all got into this conversation, and somehow the topic of the war on drugs came up, and somebody within that conversation chimed in and was like, "Nah, brother, that ain't no conspiracy. The United States government purposely allowed drugs to the neighborhood so they could destroy the black community." No, sir. The United States government would never do such a thing. MAGA. Have you ever been in one of those conversations? Or maybe you've heard people, talking about it. Did the United States government, in fact, purposely target a specific group or groups of people when it declared a war on drugs? Was the war on drugs for the good of the country? Or was it done specifically to target and destroy a specific group in this country for political gain or for some other ulterior motive? So let's just jump straight into this. So, the first person that people think about when the war on drugs comes to mind is this guy, Ronald Reagan. Then they'll think about this.
Big pot boy.
No.
Cocaine?
No thanks.
Yo, my man, you want some lubes?
No what? If someone offers you drugs, instead of saying something you really don't mean, just say no.
Got some centimillion for you. No.
No. No big production number. Just say no. You'd be surprised how well it works. No.
And they'll probably, this is my favorite right here, they'll probably think about this.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
You gotta love those old commercials, man. Man, I crack up every time I see them. But anyway, Ronald Reagan is the person who gets credit for the war on drugs. And, I just kind of find it funny because me and my partner was in a conversation about this today. Shout out to my boy Rod and my partner Nola Joe. But we was in a conversation about this. And my boy Rod was telling me that he's reading Rick Ross's book. Rick Ross, the rapper from Miami. Not the real Rick Ross, the one we call Freeway Ricky Ross from California. Yeah, he's talking about the rapper reading his book. Anyway, so he was saying that he's reading Rick Ross's book, and Rick Ross is talking about the drugs in Miami. He's talking about the war on drugs, and he mentioned Ronald Reagan. And I was telling him that nah, Ronald Reagan's not the guy that's responsible for what we call the modern war on drugs. And to find the guy who started it all, you got to go back about a decade or so prior to Ronald Reagan taking office. So when you look back, you'll find this guy, none other than Richard M. Nixon. Let me break this down because you have to understand what was going on in the country during this time. So I believe that we have to go backwards and then bring this thing forward. So during this time, there was you got to remember we were coming out of the 60s, and we saw a lot of illicit drug use, especially among the youth in this country. And the one thing about Richard Nixon is that if you study him, you'll find that he despised drug use, especially among young people, because he considered that a form of social rot, which made he felt that it made America look weak. So in addition to the youth using drugs, we had this other situation that some of y'all might have heard of called Vietnam. And according to which reports you may believe, if you watch, the news of the time, or if you watch documentaries or you watch movies, we know how the movies can be. But according to what source you believe, it's been reported that some service members who were currently serving in Vietnam was using drugs. Now, the numbers and to what degree, that is debatable. As you can see here, according to a 1971 report by the Department of Defense. 51% of the armed forces had smoked marijuana. 31% had used psychedelics such as LSD. Then you got the shrooms. An additional 28% had taken hard drugs such as cocaine and heroin. And if you notice, I got marijuana and heroin. It's highlighted. So I want y'all to keep those two drugs in particular in mind. Regardless of, which sources you may believe, some sources say, the numbers are higher, some may say they're lower. The fact still remains that there were service members who were using drugs in a combat zone. And many of those service members became addicts and they returned home addicted to drugs. There were others who may have used drugs, but they weren't necessarily addicted to them. But, some returned home and got on drugs. That's fact. So Richard Nixon felt that the country was obligated to do something about the fact that we had people who had fought in a war, many of whom were drafted, and it wasn't their fault that they were put in this stressful situation. But you know what? Let me stop for a second and let you all hear it, from Richard Nixon in his words and during that time.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had.
All right, buckle up, because here we go. Y'all gonna see me moving around a lot because I'm getting kind of antsy. This speech right here that he made in June of 1971 is what started the war on drugs. He started off by saying that America's public enemy number one is drug abuse. And he goes on to talk about education, and some other things. So I think it's important to note that if you study the war on drugs in the initiation of it, when it first started, it focused on education, treatment, and prevention. And they hit it hard, and Congress was funding it, and they dumped a lot of money into those 3 areas: education, treatment, and prevention. So much so that we had not seen the likes of that until Barack Obama came into office. Because what they did was they took it, they attacked it from the angle of a public health crisis, is what they did. Oh, you mean like now? How they look into this so-called opioid epidemic as a public health crisis, and they sending people to rehab instead of sending them to prison? Okay, now, again, so they dumped a lot of money in this. We hadn't seen anything like this much money put into, the education, the prevention, or the treatment and prevention of drug abuse. We hadn't seen anything like that. I mean, and how you know is this. So let me just go out on a limb here and say, you about to mention the crack epidemic. Right on there, my brother. Because y'all remember this whole thing that we had like during the 80s and the 90s called the crack epidemic? They didn't pump that much money into it. You know what I'm saying? They just, hey, they did crack, we just gonna lock them up, Yeah. You got a pretty interesting point. Yeah, that's interesting. But those people deserved that. They were smoking crack and leaving crack babies everywhere. Oh, but anyway, that's a whole nother video. That's a whole nother subject. By looking at the issue of drug abuse, in the country at this time, by them looking at it, from the angle of, public health issue. I personally think that, they went about it the right way, because it was working. Congress was funding it. They were pumping money into, these rehab programs and stuff. So it was working because you really don't, people who are addicted to drugs, I mean, do you really want to lock them up, versus trying to give them treatment? I mean, locking them up work because, hey, you going to quit cold turkey. Well, I guess because it's all kind of drugs in prison. But then again, we talking about 1971. So, they did go at it at the right angle. But all good things must come to an end. So instead of going at this from the public health angle, they started and they shifted over to the law enforcement side. And probably because it was politically convenient for Richard Nixon to do so. Because we got to remember that 1972, it was an election year. This joker was trying to get reelected. So what he did was he played on people's concerns about black crime and drug abuse among white Southerners. And how he did it was through what we now call the Southern strategy.
The question is, what is the Southern strategy and why is it important? Well, 1964, as he signed the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation in the South, Lyndon Johnson turned to an aide and he said, I think I just gave away the South for the rest of the century, which actually turned out to be remarkably true. As the Democratic Party identified itself with the cause of civil rights, with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it lost the support of many whites in the South. And the Republican Party, beginning with Barry Goldwater in 64 and continuing through Richard Nixon in 68, and eventually with Ronald Reagan in 1980, begins to capture the South. Remember, the South was the most Democratic part of the country. It voted solidly Democratic in almost every presidential election from the Civil War right up until 1968. After 1968, there is this significant shift that takes place as white voters move from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. And the Southern strategy is the technique developed by Republicans to try to reach out to the white South, disaffected with the growing liberal views of the Democratic Party, especially on race after 1964, and it's remarkably effective.
So now we understand what the Southern strategy is and why it's important. I'm also glad that he explained the switch in the parties of how white Democrats went over to the Republican Party and how blacks who were primarily Republican switched over to the Democratic Party. Because you heard this a lot, during the past election, and you often hear, that blacks were primarily Republican. And it is a true statement. Blacks were pretty much primarily Republican. So you hear that a lot. But the one thing that people that make that statement, they never tell you is why. But, that's another video for another time. Let's take this thing on home. Nixon shifted to the right on this Get Tough on Crime platform. And I got to tell y'all, anytime you start hearing politicians start pushing this Get Tough on Crime agenda, you better look out. Because a whole lot of people is going to prison. Yep, and oftentimes they don't fill it with people who look like the politician. Remember, we're still focusing on 1972. And Nixon had just shifted to the right. He had came out with this Get Tough on Crime platform, that he's pushing. And he came out with this statement. Today, our balanced, comprehensive attack on drug abuse moves forward in yet another critical area as we institute a major new program to drive drug traffickers and drug pushers off the streets of America. And with that, what he did was he announced the creation of the Office for Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, which is the precursor to the DEA, which came along in 1973. Another thing that happened in 1972, because I gotta throw this in here, was the Watergate break-in, and it happened in June of 1972. So think about it for a minute. We got an election year. We got a president that is going for re-election. We got this, and y'all can go study Watergate, but we got the Watergate break-in. So perhaps this may explain the reason for the shift. This may explain why he took the so-called war on drugs from education, prevention, and basically rehab over to this get tough on crime agenda, because he knew, or maybe he knew, what was going to come out of this Watergate thing, and it was going to, kind of sweep the nation. And maybe he was trying to use this get tough on crime agenda as a distraction technique. Now, another thing that happened in 1973, okay, we're going forward to 1973, because 1973 was wild. You had the governor of New York, who was Nelson Rockefeller. Where Rockefeller records get their name from, the Rockefeller family. Yeah. So Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York. And what he did was he came up, or he actually proposed harsher prison sentences, which included mandatory minimum sentences for drug trafficking. So guess what Richard Nixon did? He took a page out of Nelson Rockefeller's book, and he proposed his own plan to step up prison sentences to include mandatory minimum sentences for drugs. Has anyone stopped to wonder, throughout all of this, how did Nixon go from fighting this so-called war on drugs from a public safety standpoint and totally going the opposite direction and tackling this thing from the law enforcement side? Because it kind of make you wonder, if he hated drugs as much as, it is said that he did, why would you suddenly shift gears? So my question is, why would he do that? If you went from a very successful program and, of helping people and treating people, for who were addicted to drugs, and the government was funding it, and it was working, to all of a sudden you get law enforcement involved. So you go from helping people to locking them up, and you stop funding the education and, the treatment and sending people to rehab, and you started funding, law enforcement. You started pushing all of these policies that made the sentences stricter for people, selling drugs and getting caught with drugs, possession, and all kinds of other stuff. I mean, that kind of don't make sense. And again, I understand, politics. I got it. But it makes me wonder if there was another motive. Maybe this next clip will explain it all. And it's a statement that was made in 1994 by John Erlichman, who was Nixon's chief domestic advisor. I want y'all to check this out real quick.
Want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
All right, so let's talk about this real quick. This is what Erlichman said in 1994. He said, do you want to know what it's about, or what it's really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies. That was the anti-war left and black people. Okay, so let's stop right there for a second. Okay, so the anti-war left. So basically, you hear the terms right and left, in politics a lot. So you had those people who were on the left and they were against the war. So he included the hippies in here because if you know anything about the hippies, they were free-loving people, but they were against the war. And they protested, man. And they were peacefully protesting, but they were protesting. And when I tell you we're against the war, they were against the war, and they were not afraid to let you know that they were against the war. Now, one thing we got to keep in mind about Richard Nixon is that Richard Nixon was really a hateful dude. He really was, man. He was grimy too. But Richard Nixon kept an enemies list. And the one thing about this dude is that he set out to destroy anyone that he felt that was going to stand in his way, of getting reelected. So part of the reason why he hated the anti-war left is because we were neck deep in Vietnam, like in 1968. We were neck deep in the war, and you had the hippies who had aligned themselves with the left because they were against the war. Nixon had already, he's proven, man, if you study him, that the dude was willing to lie, cheat, steal, break laws, destroy people, and anybody who stood in his way from from political gain. Another thing that I think is important to remember of, why he hated the hippies, was because you got to remember back then in the 60s and 70s, they were considered to be a part of the counterculture. And the counterculture, it was characterized by the rejection of conventional social norms. So, back then, everything, those folks want everything to be squeaky clean, and peace, justice, and the American way. And the hippies, they weren't even trying to hear it. They went against everything that was a social norm. And Richard Nixon hated it. Then you have blacks. So it is well documented that Richard Nixon was racist. The first thing that comes to mind is that in the tapes that have been released, Richard Nixon recorded a lot of stuff. He recorded his phone calls and all kinds of stuff from his office. And there was a recording that I heard of him and Ronald Reagan, and they were talking about a few things, but they were talking about a lot of the leaders of the African countries. And so in that conversation, the word monkeys came up, and it's like the tail wagging the dog, right? So go look it up though, man. It's just I'm smiling, because people think that this is conspiracy, or that's just what people say. No, it's true. So, and then the other thing you have to remember is that Richard Nixon, in his bid for re-election in 1972, he employed the Southern strategy. And that was all about getting Southern whites back into the fold of the Republican Party. And what better way to do that than to target blacks? So there you have it. I just kind of laid it all out there. Now, I'm not telling you to believe, anything that I said. I'm not telling you to believe any of the sources that I used. But what I encourage you to do is, use the Google machine or pick up a book and do your own research. And that's what I do. I don't necessarily listen to a person's opinion. I listen, but I don't take it as law. I do my own research. And what I do is I gather facts. So, facts. It is a fact that Richard Nixon had an enemies list. It is a fact that dude would do anything, break the law or whatever it took, to reach whatever his goals. It is a fact that he did not like, as a matter of fact, he hated the anti-war left or anyone that was against, the war, because Vietnam was not a popular war, and he was up for, during 1972, he was up for re-election. And that anti-war left was a thorn in his side, to include the hippies who aligned themselves with the anti-war left. And keep in mind that the hippies were a part of the counterculture, and they went against everything that was considered a social norm. And Nixon did not like that. Now, it is also a fact that he was racist. Go listen to the tapes. We know that he did not like blacks. I personally think that, it's shameful that what he did was politically motivated and it was racially motivated. And those around him knew what they were doing. So, hey, form your own opinion. Hey, this is C. Hess with Motivated Minds, and I just want you to think about it.